we go.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is a part of our webinar series. We've been hosting a couple of different webinars every month for the last few months at BSD Education around relevant topics in digital skills education, really, but also about tools and processes for teaching in hybrid environments and face-to-face classrooms. Because at BSD we provide a service with education curriculum, and we know and understand uniquely the situation that teachers are in, because many of us, including myself, have been teachers or are still currently doing some teaching through online environments. So all of you that are here today, thank you so much for joining us. This session is being recorded and is streaming live on YouTube. So we've got some people who have joined on Zoom as well as through YouTube. And as always, because it's being recorded, this session will be available to view afterwards for yourself. And you can also share it with your colleagues. So if you're here in the Zoom, there's no need to turn your camera on or anything. I'm actually about to share my screen and the slides for the webinar. However, if you have a question or a comment or something you'd like to discuss, you're welcome to place those comments into the chat. And my colleague Beth will be monitoring the chat room as we go throughout the session. And at the end of the session, there'll be some opportunity and some time for me to answer those questions, and also for you to ask any follow-up questions that you may have about the content. So give me just a second. I'm going to gather my screen and share the content for today. The topic for today is about formative assessment. And specifically, we're looking at formative assessment as a way to deliver assessment in hybrid classrooms. So we realize that a lot of people around the world are currently teaching a little bit face-to-face and also in digital spaces. So how can we best kind of create formative assessments that can necessitate the proper approach to assessment in both of those realms? So the agenda for today is I first want to give a little bit of a background about BSD education. Those of you that are new to BSD are here for the first time, just to share a little bit about what we do. I'll save more about what we do towards the end by showing you some examples of how we embed formative assessment into our curriculum as best practices. Secondly, we'll describe in more detail what exactly is formative assessment, and give you some resources and some ways that you can try to do formative assessment in your classrooms. And then we're also going to share effective practices that we use at BSD that are useful to anyone who wants to conduct formative assessment. And we'll also share a little bit about our philosophy and our approach to why we think formative assessment is really one of the best ways to assess students' learning abilities, skill, knowledge, comprehension, etc. So those of you who are new and don't know me, my name is Mark, and I'm the Vice President of Education for BSD, and I oversee the curriculum development and also professional development that we provide. But one of my main goals is to make sure that all of the content that we produce and share, whether it's with students, teachers, or in professional development, aligns to our pedagogical process, which is all research-based and has been accredited by Digital Promise. So our approach and our methods are all research-based and accredited. Besides that, I'm also a student myself, and I'm studying at Chiang Mai University in northern Thailand, which is currently where I'm coming to you from. And in my university study, I'm trying to learn more about how children can best use artificial intelligence as a way to reflect on biases that we have about ourselves and biases that are a part of algorithmic systems, which will be part of the topics in the 2022 webinar series. So once we get through the holidays and we're back delivering more professional development in the new year, you can look forward to hearing more about artificial intelligence and how it affects the classroom and some practical tools that you can use. And I'll even share later some opportunities where you can even start sooner than that with Hour of Code. So at BSD, we really provide a kind of an entire support mechanism, which starts with our curriculum. So our curriculum are a set of courses that teach children how to code in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript inside of broader projects that are aligned to digital skills standards. To deliver that curriculum, we have an innovative platform that contains the curriculum and contains the formative assessments that we'll show you today. And it contains classroom features to help you keep your students organized and engaged. In order to best help you facilitate the learning of that curriculum, we provide training and support to help teachers get up to speed with their own coding ability and digital skills learning so that they can transfer that to students. All of those things combined together makes real impact because all of the content that we provide is based on real world scenarios, real world projects, having students use real code, not pseudocode, not block-based code, but real HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which is transferable to workforce and beyond. So at BSC, the way that we do that is we have three main areas in which we design curriculum for. The first is, the hard skills, like I mentioned, the coding using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But inside of that, we also want students to learn how to use those skills to create content, to understand and interpret data and provide a meaningful analysis of what data can tell us. Along with that, we have soft skills that are kind of built into the nature of doing project work, which includes, communication, creativity, collaboration, critical thinking. And then we kind of put that all together with this glue that we call CARE. And so CARE stands for curiosity, adaptability, resilience, and empathy. And these are areas of concern that we feel are vital and important to embedding in our curriculum because it helps round out the whole student and the whole educator. If you want to know more about how we do that, I'm going to ask you to refer back to one of our previous webinars where we discuss in greater detail about the CARE philosophy and even how you can start to implement the CARE philosophy in your own classroom practices, and also about our annual CARE awards that we produce at BSD Education. So on to the main agenda item for today. The topic is about formative assessment. So I'm going to approach formative assessment as if maybe you don't know much about it. I'm sure that you probably have some knowledge about it. Let's start with kind of basic knowledge, and then I'll explain more as we go and describe in more detail how we use formative assessment in our own practices. So this is a definition that comes from the Northwest Evaluation Association. NWEA designs research-based assessments, and they do a lot of research around the power of formative assessment. But they say that formative assessment is a planned, ongoing process used by all students and teachers. It's very important that teachers are included in this process during the learning and teaching to elicit and use evidence of student learning to improve student understanding of the intended outcomes, and to then support those students to become self-directed learners. That's a big definition. And so I really like their approach to this definition because it really encompasses all the necessary elements of what formative assessment should be. And first, I do just want to kind of talk about our particular stance on assessment at BSD. Coming from the education system and working in the education system, being brought up through the education system, I think that a lot of people, were kind of just culturally trained to think about assessment as more of a summative thing, and that assessment is a way to gauge my ability and my skills so that I can move on to the next grade, or that I can move on in my class. And a lot of us have a really deep stigmatized negative view of assessment because we tend to, as human beings, we tend to internalize labels of assessment. For example, think back to a time in your own schooling when you received a letter grade, like a letter F. So maybe you've been like a straight A student your whole life, and then all of a sudden you get to ninth grade algebra and you get your first F, and you're like, oh wow, that really hits hard. And you start to internalize that label, and you start to say, well, I'm just an F algebra student. And so you make that a part of your identity. I'm just a or whatever, I'm no good at that. So, we believe at BSD that we don't want to continue with those false narratives of self-identifying with the negative association of assessment. So we think that assessments, the end goal, like this definition, is to support students, to help them become self-directed learners, so that we can see assessment as a way to help us instead of a way to hinder us or to hold us back. So we think that a formative assessment isn't just necessarily to provide a grade, which is a lot of why we do assessments. Assessments are typically used for us to get a grade because we educate in a system that requires grades and grade point averages and cumulative, summative, semester averages for grades, and those things really only tell us one part of the picture. But if we think back to what an assessment was designed to do, the intentional purpose of an assessment is actually just to gauge where the child is and then help them succeed. And what happens a lot of times with assessment is that we give the assessment and then we move on. Okay, maybe you got an F in algebra on the first quiz. And if the teacher is savvy about formative assessment, they would go back and they would help you, and they would determine how you got an F, help you fill in the gaps that cause you to get that F, so that you don't do that F again, so that you can continue your learning and you can move on. But what often happens, and this is not really necessarily on purpose, but it's by design, because we have to cover so much content, that we just move on. And then the student starts to struggle more, and then by the end of the semester, the child hates algebra. This is very common. So we think that assessment is really, it should be a tool to help children succeed, and it shouldn't be seen as a tool that hinders or stifles or labels or makes you identify with anything that's negative. So here are some things that we recommend that you do, especially if you're working in hybrid environments. We think that a formative assessment process can be just as simple as asking questions. So when you're asking questions to your students, you're looking for engagement, you're looking for knowledge, you're looking for comprehension, you're looking for understanding. And if you think back to your own classroom practices as a teacher, sometimes you may ask a question, and you get one or two students with their hands always up. There's always those two students that will answer every question. And sometimes we call on those students, and we certainly want them to share what they know. But in order for us to get a thorough understanding of what all students know in the classroom, we need to devise ways to actually hear those other students. Okay, so sometimes we can just ask a question broadly to the classroom and then get a few answers and then have a discussion. But I highly recommend that during your online teaching that you design into your schedule at some point some time for one-on-one discussions with students. So maybe there's that quiet child in the back of the classroom that doesn't really raise their hand too often. That's the one you really need to get out and discuss and have one-on-one time. Another way to get a totality of feedback from your students is by using a feedback instrument or a discussion instrument, which for me, most of the time is just a Google form. So I might make a Google form that has a variety of questions. And what I like about Google Forms is that you can have like the long response, you can have the short answer response, the multiple choice, the true false. And so I might design a quick feedback instrument. And when I assign this to students, I don't tell them it's a test. It's not an assessment. It's a feedback instrument, and I use that vocabulary with my students, and that lowers the stakes. Sometimes, if you say there's a test, immediately blood pressure rises. Students start to get worried. So if I say feedback instrument, that really kind of just lowers the anxiety a bit, and I find that students are more likely to to take it seriously, but not so seriously that they are getting worked up by it. So formative assessment isn't just a kind of a one and done thing. It's not something that you just do at the end of a lesson or at the end of a unit or the end of a chapter, but it should be something that is planned, which means that you've thought about it ahead of time, and then it's ongoing. It's kind of a cyclical process where it continues on and on. So the way that I plan for formative assessment feedback is that whenever I'm about to teach a new lesson, I usually just write down 3 or 4 questions, specific questions that I know that I'm going to ask during the start of that lesson or during the middle of that lesson to check for understanding. So, I always keep a little notebook handy when I'm teaching, and I might just jot those down quickly for the day. And so it's not like I have to plan it out in my lesson plan, but it's just kind of my daily planning that I do when I'm about to teach a class. I also want to make sure that I'm going to plan tasks inside of the learning, inside the lessons that might have a range of ability. So in the realm of the things that I teach digital skills, I teach coding, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, design, these kind of things. So typically I design projects that allow students multiple levels of entry so that a student with no level of knowledge of coding can complete the project, as well as students who've been coding for 3 or 4 years, they will be able to complete the project, but at a different level. So that requires me to plan ahead of time. And then alongside of that, I also need to think about what kinds of struggles students may encounter along the way. For example, I know that if I have students who are new to coding, they're going to struggle with switching between the different tabs in the project between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you've ever done any coding with those 3 languages, those 3 languages each have a different file. And so those files are linked to each other through different types of syntax. So it takes a little bit of time to get that process down. So I know that I'll want to ask specific questions and design opportunities for students to engage in those activities. So, and when I think about formative assessment this way, it becomes more natural. It becomes a part of the learning process. It becomes a way for us to continually get and receive feedback so that we can help students achieve, we can help them move beyond their struggles instead of always penalizing them for what they've done wrong. So, if I was teaching a coding class and every time a student made a mistake, imagine like a big red X shows up on the screen. And that would be really demotivating. And, that's the opposite of what we think assessment is really designed to do. So we also think that, assessment, there's a heavy responsibility that lies on the teacher as well as the students. And whenever you explain to students that assessment is a way for us to help each other, I think that it lowers the stakes for students and they feel a little bit more comfortable. So they can take on the role of the learner truly and intentionally, like it was designed to be. And teachers have the responsibility for asking those questions and also for setting the stage for opportunities to come about where students might have to be tested in their ability, but not in the usual sense of a test, but like the real world kind of test. So one thing that we're constantly looking for as teachers is we're looking for evidence. And so evidence can appear in a lot of different ways. There can be verbal evidence. So that means a student could be articulating their understanding and their comprehension of the content. Then there's visual evidence. So there's also a demonstration of evidence. So we can see what students have created and made and written as a visual evidence. And then there's the demonstrative evidence is what have students done with that? What can they show? What is the final outcome of that? And also I like to add in here that peers, so student to students, can also be a part of this formative process. And also through most of my teaching, I'm teaching with project-based learning. And so in project-based learning, there's actually a protocol called Critical Friends. And Critical Friends is a formative feedback process in which students are giving feedback to other students with a script. And I really like the script that they have to use in this protocol. It's called I like and I wonder. So if a student ever has to give a negative feedback, they have to wrap it up in this sentence stem, I like, I wonder. So you can't just say, oh, that's ugly. Why would you do that? You would say, I really like your website, but I wonder why you chose to use a yellow background with pink letters. That's very hard on my eyes. So it pushes students to put their feedback into a positive spin, and it helps to create kind of an atmosphere of congeniality amongst the peers, so that assessment is seen as something that's positive, something that's helpful, something that's useful, instead of something that's negative, that penalizes, and that makes us feel bad about ourselves. So like I mentioned in the original definition from NWEA, the ultimate outcome, the ultimate goal of assessment is really to support students to become self-directed learners. So, in the theory of education, there's kind of this gradual release methodology, which means in the beginning, when students are learning a new concept, they need to be guided. They need their hand held. They need to be shown every step of the way. As they get more practice with that skill or that knowledge, then you can ease up a little bit and you can allow them to try, and they might make mistakes along this path, but you guide them through those mistakes and help them to solve problems and help them to overcome those things. And so we can't use assessment practices that penalize students for failures. And this is the major problem with assessment, is that we see failure as a negative thing. So when I get an F, I say, oh, I'm a bad person, I can't do that. But if we looked at it instead as an opportunity for us to relearn something so that we can succeed, then it wouldn't be seen as such a negative thing. So in this gradual release method, we want students to eventually to get to the place where they can fly on their own, and they don't need that hand-holding support. So that's the ultimate goal. That's the ultimate outcome. And formative assessment is how we gradually release students into that space where they can become self-directed learners. So that was kind of my overview of formative assessment, and I get a little preachy about it because I'm very passionate about it. Because it affected me as a child, and I remember having negative self-thoughts about myself because of poor grades. But also I've seen it in my own children, and I've seen it in my own students, and I see it every day in schools that I work with around the world. So it's the real thing, and it's very important that we try to shift our thinking about formative assessment to be something that can be used to help students instead of to hinder students. So the next section I want to talk about is some practical formative assessment methods and effective strategies that we can use to conduct formative assessments in classrooms, especially around the hybrid environments. So the three areas I'll want you to kind of think about, and I'll guide you through these three questions a little bit more as we go. But first is where am I going with formative assessment? Where am I now? What is my current knowledge of formative assessment? And where to next? What can I start to implement right away, today, tomorrow, next week in my own classrooms that can help me to shift the model of formative assessment to being helpful instead of hindering? So the first question, where am I going? This is I want you to think about it kind of like before you teach a lesson, before you begin the study today. What is it exactly you're trying to get students to learn, and how can you properly gauge if they're successful without giving them a test, like a multiple choice test? What are some other ways that we can start to elicit and understand and comprehend what students know, and how can they demonstrate that? Then how can students start to compare themselves to that target that you set for them in order for them to know if they're meeting that standard? So it's also important that students know where the goal is. And that's another problem with assessment, is that if you take a test, the test is usually like a surprise. I mean, like, the content on the test isn't supposed to be a surprise, but the questions are usually, you've never seen them before. And so their anxiety comes from that area alone. But if you explain to students what the end goal is and what you want them to accomplish, they can also start to self-assess themselves about how close they are to that target. So we've got formative assessment happening on both ends of the spectrum now, from the teacher and from the student, both all trying to reach a similar goal. So the next question, where am I now? This is more about in the moment. So during the instruction, while you're delivering instruction, you should be observing the students and listening to what they say, so that you know exactly when they're encountering a difficulty. You shouldn't find out that your students aren't doing well, at the end of the lesson, or at the end of the course, at the end of the semester when they get an F in the test. You should know way ahead of that time, because you should be paying very close attention to their knowledge and their skills and their attainment and their feedback, and that all happens naturally through conversation and through observation. And another way to help students with this is when you do give them feedback, it's important to give them very descriptive feedback. So if you were to congratulate a student on a project, instead of just saying, good job in the project, you should say, I really like the way you organized your material, and I like the way that you presented the data and the graphs for blah, blah, blah. Or if it was something negative, you can say, I think you really could have shown more examples on this particular part of the project. I really think that you could have explained more detail on the descriptive narrative. So description is important to help us with feedback, because it tells us precisely and exactly what needs to be changed, fixed, or edited, instead of just a generic F or a C. If you get that kind of feedback, it doesn't really help you. It just tells you that you've done something bad. And then lastly, student self-assessment means that the students are starting to internalize, and they start to look at how they are achieving. And for me, because I teach through project-based learning, the best way that I've seen for students to be able to self-assess is through the use of a rubric. And so a rubric is that guide. It's the target, right, of how you want your students to perform on a certain task. And the rubric will lay out a description of all of the targets on a particular project. And so if you give students that rubric ahead of time for the project, they can always refer back to that rubric, and they can self-assess, where am I on this rubric? How far have I come? Where do I still need to go? Where do I still need support? Where can I ask the teacher for help? So we really want to drive students towards being self-assessors. We want them to have that experience. So here are some methods that I use in the classroom, and these methods work in face-to-face or in virtual settings. So the first method is called Fishbowl, in which a small group of students will get together and share about a particular topic or demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of a particular topic, while the rest of the class is listening, and they're observing, and they might even be writing down questions. So the way that I conduct Fishbowl online is typically, I use Zoom, and I'll ask for the whole class to turn their microphones on to mute, except for the 3 or 4 students who are going to be in the fishbowl. So then those students turn their camera on and they turn their microphone on, and then I give them a timer. There might be 3 minutes, 5 minutes for them to all discuss and share their understanding of a particular topic. Now, me as the teacher, I might moderate that a bit. I might ask some probing questions, or just to kind of get the conversation going. Or if I notice that one student is being silent the whole time, I'll direct a question directly at that student. But Fishbowl is a kind of a cool thing, because the spotlight is on just a few students at a time instead of the whole entire group. And what I expect the other students to be doing during the Fishbowl is for them to be asking questions, or writing those down, possibly in the Zoom chat. And then me as the moderator, I might look through the chat and then pick a couple of questions from the student audience and ask that to the group. Fishbowl is one of my favorites. I've been using it all the time now. It's great for just 3 to 5 minutes. You pick a different group of students every time. You might do it once a day. You might do it twice a week. It's really up to you, but it's a fun one to do. I think students enjoy it. The next one is traffic light, and traffic light is kind of more of a visual cue that can be ongoing at any point, during a lesson or during an activity. But basically, if you think about the stoplight system, red means I need help, or I need to stop, I'm lost. Yellow means I'm a little vague on it, I probably need some help. And then green is don't worry about me, I've got this, I'm smooth sailing. So there's some different ways that you can implement this in your classroom. When I was teaching face-to-face, I actually used to kind of have like index cards at the table, and I would just ask students to move the index card towards the right-hand corner of the table, so I could just scan the room and see a visual cue for, hey, I see a kid with the red, I need to circle around that student. But lately, I've been using the Zoom features. You've got the emojis that you can now you can click on one of the emojis, and it kind of just hovers over your head during the Zoom class. So I use those. So you can kind of design your own system. It doesn't have to be red, yellow, green. It could be thumbs up, thumbs down, smiley face, mad face, whatever. But as long as it's kind of a visual system that helps students to, without really breaking into the discussion or without stopping you as a teacher, they can let you know with a visual cue that they need some help. So it's a formative assessment strategy that starts with the student. So the student has to initiate this formative assessment strategy. Next one is an old but classic perfect one that I tend to just pick up on anytime we're having a group discussion, because if we're having a group discussion, it's more of the whole class, but then I want to activate every student and I want every student to share. So think, pair, share is a great way to quickly engage every student. So if you're asking a question, and you have 30 students, it's not just one student who raises their hand and answers the question, but with think, pair, share, you've got every student in the room turning to a partner and discussing that question. Typically, I'll throw up a timer and I'll say think, pair, share for a minute. They might think for 10 to 15 seconds, then pair and share. And then I might even ask them to partner up again. Okay, turn around to someone else and continue the think, pair, share. It's just an effective strategy. And then to do this online, you may want to employ the use of breakout rooms. So breakout rooms, you can break out kids into pairs, open up the breakout rooms, set a timer, and then bring them all back into the main classroom. So the last question I asked for you to think about for yourself is where to next. So formative assessment is a way for us to gauge the daily learning. What is it that's being comprehended in my classroom right now, this week, what I'm teaching? But really, in that gradual release method where we want students to eventually become self-directed learners, we also need them to self-reflect on what they've learned at the end of a lesson or at the end of the day or at the end of the chapter or whatever. And then also to think about some goals that they may have that start to formulate because of their learning. So for me, as an F algebra student, it would have been helpful for me to set a goal of, I really need to learn more about linear expressions, or I really need to refer back to my PEMDAS strategies. So those would have been helpful ways to help me as a young learner learning algebra. Because then, I ended up struggling with algebra the whole year because I didn't receive these types of assessment strategies to really help me. Instead, I was hindered by the assessment process and never really felt a strong confidence with algebra. So I've shared with you some formative assessment strategies that I use and that we employ at BSD, but now I want to give you kind of an inside look at how we at BSD Education embed these formative strategies into our curriculum, into our platform. It's baked in already, so you don't even have to think about it. They're just there to use at your disposal. So here is a screenshot. Those of you that aren't BSD customers, I'll just kind of guide you through what our curriculum looks like. So on the right-hand side, this is a course that's called Technology in the Community. It's a 40-hour course that teaches digital skills and coding together. One of the projects is called Interactive Story. Interactive Story is a coding project where students make kind of like a choose your own adventure story. And so we have embedded quizzes. So every project has 3 or 4 questions after the project that ask questions about syntax. So their comprehension and understanding of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, the way that these quizzes work is that if you miss a question, it gives you a hint, and then it kind of rotates that question back to the end again. So it's not like you take the quiz and then get an F or an A at the end. You get multiple attempts and you get hints to try to figure out that quiz. So the quiz is a formative strategy. We also have formative quizzes built into the slides, which is what this looks like. So all of our content comes with slides that the teacher uses during lecture or during presentation. And so we have questions that are built into the slides itself. So in the interactive story slides, here's an example of some content, and part of the topic of this project is about learning about how to design for a target audience. So if you were going to make an interactive story, you might want to make that interactive story for a young adult audience, or maybe you want to make it for boys who like video games, as an example. But any target audience that you may want to choose. So this is just a quick quiz to test your understanding of what does it mean to have a target audience, and those are built into the slides, so they're much more flexible for deeper discussions. And you could even do a think, pair, share with this question straight from the slides. I mentioned earlier that we have like kind of the quizzes, and those are auto-graded. So the quizzes do focus in on the syntax. So typically we give students an example piece of code, then we ask them, a specific question about that. So, this says on line 24 of the HTML below, what is the span used for? What is the span tag? And so during the project, students would have learned that, and then it shows students the right answer and gives them a hint if they are not able to identify the correct answer. We also provide opportunities for teachers to provide live feedback. So as a classroom teacher using BSD education, you can see all of the students who are in your classroom. You can see which questions they have answered and what is their progress level at. If you see that a student is stuck at any particular step along the way, you can also reach out to that student using our chat feature. So you can ask your students, Han Solo, I see you haven't started the test yet. Are you stuck somewhere, or can I help you? Or Ali, test student, I see that you finished the test and made 100. Are you ready to move on to the next part, or do you have any questions? Alongside our coding projects, besides the quizzes, while students are actually coding in the project, we can also reach out to students in the same manner and provide live feedback. So as a teacher, I can see all of my students and I can see the code that they're actually typing. So if Lois Lane is working on this project and they're on line 9 of the CSS file, and they're having trouble, with the syntax here, I can quickly look at their screen and say, hey, Lois, it looks like you're about to use the color property. You want to make sure that you've got the right colon at the end of the line, because remember in CSS, we always use the colon at the end. So I can see the code, I can provide direct live feedback and help the student right where they are. And that's a really great feature to have, especially when you're learning how to code. I mentioned earlier that I said that rubrics are probably the best way to move students towards self-assessment. So we have a rubric for all of our capstone projects. So if you're in a classroom and you finish the main course projects, the final project in all of our courses is a capstone in which students customize and they can create a new web-based project. And so we have 3 areas of expectations: visual design, content, and overall effort. So the teacher can fill out this rubric for an assessment as well as the students. So students can self-assess and teachers can also reflect. So this is kind of a printable document. You can have a PDF and fill it out, or you can print it out and write on it. But this is a rubric that would need to be shared ahead of time so students understand what the targets are. So we think it's important that students start to become involved in the assessment process. And I mentioned earlier that one way to do that is always showing the rubric in advance. And this allows students to see the target, but also to continually reflect on their process along the way. So when the student's about halfway done with the project, they might look back at the rubric and say, so they might read this: students have used content that fits the desired theme and not copied and demonstrate to understand use of including titles, text, and images. So they might go back and look at this. Wait, are all my titles correct? Is all my text correct? Are my images correct? Does it match the theme, etc.? So they'll look at that and decide for themselves whether they need to continue working or if it's good enough. So putting this ownership back on the students helps them to become self-directed. So one thing that I've started to do with students is, after they've had a little bit of practice with self-assessment using rubrics, I start to even ask them, what are some ways that you think we should assess this? Do you think this rubric is too lenient? Do you think that we should add more fields to this rubric? And we might end up customizing the rubric and adding more items to it based on student feedback. So this gives students a bit of voice and choice. It also allows students to follow up. So when you do grade students with a rubric, so let's say that students have finished a project and you fill this rubric out and you've written, descriptive areas of improvement and areas where students are exceeding expectations. You want to go over that with the students. You want to talk to them about it. You want to share with them. You want to verbally describe what you liked or what you didn't like about the project, instead of just handing the rubric. Here you go. Here's your grade. Take it, leave it, goodbye. No, it should always be followed up with a discussion that's specific about the feedback. So you're also making a connection to the students when you do that. So if you like what you've seen so far, and you like how we've embedded formative assessment strategies throughout our curriculum, I'm going to invite you to try a free trial of our curriculum. My colleague Beth is going to place a link into the chat just now with a link to this free trial. And with the free trial, you're going to get access to 7 of our projects. And the projects are teaching students how to code with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript inside of a project where students are sharing about content information that is interesting to themselves. And so alongside that, you get access to the elements that I showed you earlier, the quizzes, the formative assessment strategies, our BSD code glossary, which teaches the syntax of all of the code. Here are the titles of the projects. This is a course that we developed that's called Code is Your Voice, because we think that code is a powerful medium for you to share what's important to you. One of my favorite projects is called The People Who Inspire Me. And with The People Who Inspire Me, the students will research 3 people in their life whom they are inspired by. They'll find images of those people, and then they'll build a website that lists those people, their name, an image of them, and then a short description about those people. That's kind of an entry-level project. As students progress through the project, they'll do more and more complex things, like Trivia Game Maker. They'll make their own trivia game, and so they put their own questions and their own answers there. And then Support My Cause is a project where students they think about some topic that's important to them. Maybe it's about saving animals, or protecting the environment, or picking up trash. So they create a campaign, and then they can share this campaign and collect email addresses of supporters. And by the way, every project that students make on BSD education can be saved and published online. So these projects actually get published. So you can share the link or the QR code with your friends, your family, your teachers, administrators, anyone really, because this is now live on the internet. So it can become a portfolio of your success and your projects. So if you're interested in the free trial, you're going to get access to all of these projects, and they're guided by videos. It's just really easy, simple to use, and signing up and participating in the webinar trial is very easy. So if that's interesting to you, please do sign up and let us know what you think. Lastly, we would like just to receive feedback on this particular webinar, as well as if you have ideas for future webinars you'd like to hear from us, please provide that in the feedback. So my colleague Beth is going to place the link to the feedback form in the chat. So please do take a moment to fill out the feedback form. I want to thank you all for joining me today. It's been my pleasure, and discussing formative assessment is one of those topics that's very near and dear to me. So I want to see now if there are any questions or comments, or just reflections from anyone at all in the chat. Beth, did you get any questions or comments on your end?
No questions on my end.
Okay, so thank you all for joining today, those of you that are on Zoom, and those of you that also join from YouTube Live. If you do have any questions or comments, you're always welcome to reach out to BSD Education through our contact form on our website, or also through our various social media channels. And do stay tuned because we have a few more webinars coming up this year. Next up is a webinar about coding for English language learners. And then as we get closer to Computer Science Education Week, we will host a webinar about our Hour of Code projects around digital citizenship and artificial intelligence, as well as revealing our brand new Hour of Code projects around artificial intelligence. So please do stay tuned to all of our social media channels for information on how to join those webinars and participate in the upcoming Hour of Code. Thank you all for joining. Beth, let's go.